In just a few short months from now, Canada is set to permit Canadians whose sole medical condition is mental illness to apply to the government to take their own life at the hands of the state via a lethal injection. As you all know, the Canadian government calls this MAID, Medical Assistance in Dying. But in order for that to make sense, one must accept the premise that death is an appropriate medical procedure for severe cases of mental illness. If that isn't enough to convince you that the people in charge of our country have all but given up on the most vulnerable people in our society, our countrymen, our neighbors who are silently struggling and barely getting by, what I'm about to tell you next is even worse. When Canada expands euthanasia to the mentally ill in March of 2024, it looks increasingly likely that the Canadian government is also going to expand euthanasia to people who are addicted to drugs. This was being discussed last week at a conference in British Columbia hosted by the Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine. It's painfully ironic that the only newsworthy thing to come out of this Canadian Society of Addiction Medicine conference were public calls to allow drug-addicted Canadians to kill themselves at the hands of the state. As many have pointed out, this is all beginning to look a lot like eugenics. The state being able to pick and choose which Canadian lives are of value, and which Canadian lives are worth saving, and which Canadian lives are permitted to end if that person chooses that path. The government is doing everything it can to get people addicted to drugs and to keep them addicted to drugs, and also, now, they're offering to take their lives once they get addicted to drugs. Drop a like in the video, help us out by subscribing to the True North YouTube channel, and the comment question for the episode is this: should Canada allow for people who are addicted to drugs to apply for euthanasia? Let me know in the comments, and let's get into it. Canada will legalize medically assisted dying for people addicted to drugs. That is the dystopian headline coming from Vice News of all places, which has gone viral around the world. That's because for quite some time now, the world has been looking at Canada and the MAID regime under this Liberal government with absolute disgust and shock at what they're seeing. When euthanasia became legal in Canada in 2016, just over 1,000 Canadians applied for the quote-unquote procedure, applied for death. By 2021, the last year that we have for available data when it comes to MAID, more than 10,000 Canadians took their own lives at the hands of the state via a lethal injection. For context, in 2021, MAID was the 7th leading cause of death in Canada. More Canadians died from MAID in 2021 than they did from liver disease, diabetes, pneumonia, Alzheimer's, and influenza. Now, in news that will surprise nobody, it turns out that the loudest advocates to expand MAID to include the people who are addicted to drugs are also the same people who proudly promote the policies of so-called harm reduction and safer supply. Harm reduction policies to solve the opioid and toxic drug crisis are policies that include supervised safe injection sites and clean needle exchange programs. Supervised injection sites are exactly what the name says they are, a place where addicts can take their illegal drugs in front of taxpayer-funded officials who will revive the addicts if they are overdosing. Safe supply, on the other hand, is where addicts can get hydromorphone, a more potent heroin alternative, which acts as a safer opioid alternative which won't kill the user. Thanks to reporting from journalists like Adam Zivo, we know that the Safe Supply Hydromorphone program from the government is actually fueling a black market fentanyl trade. Addicts are not taking the hydromorphone, but instead getting it for free and flipping it on the street to younger people, getting those younger Canadians addicted to drugs and into the dangerous death cycle of addiction. Spearheaded by the federal government, so-called harm reduction and safe supply programs usually go hand in hand with drug decriminalization, as we have seen in British Columbia. In May of 2022, the federal government allowed British Columbia to decriminalize the possession of hard drugs. This was in response to the absolutely devastating opioid and toxic drug crisis taking thousands of British Columbian lives a year. In fact, in 2016, British Columbia declared a state of emergency. How has drug decriminalization, harm reduction, and safe supply been working in British Columbia? Well, let's just say, not very good. British Columbia right now is on track to set the highest number of toxic drug deaths in the province's history. In the first 7 months of 2023, over 1,400 British Columbians have died due to toxic drug overdoses. And since a state of emergency was declared in 2016, over 12,000 British Columbians have died due to overdose. According to the CBC, unregulated drug toxicity is the leading cause of death in British Columbia for persons aged 10 to 59, accounting for more deaths than homicides, suicides, accidents, and natural diseases combined. The other hotbed for overdose deaths in Canada, Toronto, wants to take British Columbia's drug policies one step further. Toronto has asked the federal government to grant the city an exemption to decriminalize the possession of all hard drugs of any amount for almost any age. And to show you where the federal, provincial, and municipal governments are at when it comes to solving this problem versus just perpetuating the issues and making everyone else addicted to drugs, this should show you what you need to know. In 2017 and 2019, Toronto put forward their overdose strategy plan. This, of course, involves reliance on safe supply and harm reduction policies, which, as we've seen in British Columbia, have done absolutely nothing to stop the insane spike in deaths we're seeing. Meanwhile, when it comes to having a mental health and addictions policy in Toronto, a policy to actually solve the problem, well, there isn't one. In April of 2023, the Toronto Board of Health finally got around to asking the Chief Public Health Officer of the city to come up with a mental health and addictions policy. That policy is still not available. Now, you might think that organizations in Canada whose sole job is to keep Canadians who are struggling with mental illness alive and functioning would be telling the federal government to stop this encroachment on MAID and euthanasia immediately. To say to the federal government that expanding MAID to people whose sole condition is mental illness is a destructive policy. But if you did think that, you'd be wrong. For example, when the federal government introduced Bill C-7, a bill to pause the expansion of MAID to include the mentally ill in Canada for 1 year, the Canadian Psychiatric Association told the federal government that their decision to pause MAID to include the mentally ill was unconstitutional and discriminatory. You might think they would be telling the government that actually expanding MAID to include the mentally ill is unconstitutional and discriminatory, but no, it was their decision to stop it from happening right away that the Canadian Psychiatric Association really took issue with. If you thought that was concerning, you should also know that on February 15th, the parliamentary body in charge of debating and discussing the expansion of MAID recommended to the federal government that MAID be expanded to include, quote, mature minors whose death is, quote, reasonably foreseeable. Mature minors to be able to apply for euthanasia. Oh, and at one of these parliamentary committee meetings, a doctor from the Quebec College of Physicians also recommended that infants and babies who with severe deformations and limited chance of survival should also be eligible for MAID, for euthanasia.
These minors could, with their tutors or parental parent, could make a request for MAID based on the level of persistent and intolerable suffering that they may experience and become unmanageable and senseless. The same for babies from 0 to 1 years of age who are born with severe deformations, very grave and severe syndromes, medical syndromes, whose life expectancy and level of suffering are such that it would make sense to ensure that they do not suffer.
In fact, we're now so beyond the realm of normal that we have clothing retailers like Simon's putting together ads that promote euthanasia.
Last breaths are sacred. When I imagine my final days, I see music. I see the ocean. I see cheesecake. Even now, as I seek help to end my life, with all the pain, and in these final moments, there is still so much beauty. You just have to be brave enough to see it.
Somehow, I guess this is also supposed to encourage people to shop at Simon's. I want to show you all some conflicting public opinion data on this issue, on the issue of expanding MAID to people whose sole condition is mental illness. The activist group Dying with Dignity, whose purpose is to rapidly expand euthanasia to include as many people, it appears, as possible, put together a poll with Ipsos, a polling firm, and let me just say that the public opinion data they have is downright disturbing. Apparently, 80% of Canadians support access to MAID for those suffering solely from a severe mental illness, which is relatively unchanged from last year. 71% of Canadians support the ability for mature minors to request and be considered eligible for MAID, providing they meet all criteria under the law. And 8 in 10, or 78% of Canadians, support the removal of the reasonably foreseeable eligibility requirement from the MAID law. Meanwhile, an Angus Reid poll shows that 51% of Canadians oppose expanding MAID to people whose sole condition is mental illness. As David Brooks in The Atlantic put it, we're now seeing what liberalism to its absolute extreme looks like. As he writes in his piece in The Atlantic, once the equal and infinite dignity of all human life is compromised, everything is up for grabs. Suddenly, debates arise over which lives are worth living. Suddenly, you have a couple of doctors at the Quebec College of Physicians pushing the envelope even further, suggesting that babies with severe deformations and limited chances of survival be eligible for medically assisted death. Suddenly, people who are ill or infirm are implicitly encouraged to feel guilty for wanting to live. Human dignity, once inherent in life itself, is measured by what a person can contribute, what level of happiness she is deemed capable of enjoying, how much she costs. It feels as though instead of bringing Canadians back from the ledge, instead of offering to help them recover, instead of telling them that their life matters and there's a value to their life in this country, the government is simply nudging them off. What have we come to? All right, everyone, that's going to do it for us today on the show. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Harrison Faulkner, and this is Ratioed.